Okay, we are live. Hey, welcome everybody to Orange Audubon Society's April monthly program. We're really thrilled to have Dr. Ken Meyer. And just as soon as we turn 7 o'clock, I'll turn this over to Terry to introduce him.
Looks like we're there. Ready?
Go ahead.
Tonight, our speaker is Dr. Meyer, Dr. Ken Meyer. He studied the conservation biology of birds in Florida and beyond since the 1980s, beginning with his research on swallowtail kites, which continues to this day. He conducted studies of red-cockaded woodpeckers and the bird communities of South Florida pinelands for the National Park Service and Big Cypress National Preserve and the Everglades National Park. He provides frequent university guest lectures, conducts training workshops for conservation professionals, and presents many programs each year to citizen conservation groups like ours. And we're so glad he's here with us this evening. Please help me say hello to Dr. Ken Meyer.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on this blustery, stormy evening. I hope not in your living rooms. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what some of the species that we've been studying, what they do, what they did in the face of Hurricanes Irma and Maria back in 2017. So this is just a little opportunity we had because we were tracking these 7 species. And we had this double whammy in Florida, or the southeast, at least, of these 2 hurricanes in quick succession in 2017. So first what I'm going to do is run through the 7 species and very quickly just show you the responses of each bird, or the tag birds. We had really no idea what they would do. I think most of us would think they would get out of the way, or they would hunker down, maybe wind up under some vegetation and not transmitting very well, either because they were alive or dead. And we were a little surprised to see what happened during the passage of the hurricanes themselves. So I will go through that first species by species, but then I want to come back and revisit a few of those species and talk about what happens after the hurricanes. So here we go. And I'll be glad to take questions at the end, but I'm going to just try to do this in a continuous stream through and finish up with enough time for us to take some questions here and hear your thoughts, comments.
You might have started just a little early. There are 19 people viewing on YouTube Live and 1 on Facebook. So
Okay.
We could just kind of go a little slow here at the beginning.
Okay, I can always go slower. So these are the hurricanes we're talking about. Incredible storms. And I think one of the very important messages here, personally, I think there's 2 or 3. One is what happens to birds when they're directly in the path of a storm this severe. And of course, it's a continuum. Tropical storms, when they become more intense, higher velocity winds, they become hurricanes. And then, of course, they're a continuum of relatively mild, if there is such a thing, Category 1 all the way up through Category 5 hurricanes. There's been talk sometimes recently about creating a Category 6. So that alludes to one of the other messages of this program, and that is what we are facing, the many things we're facing, but specifically this aspect of effects of climate change. As the oceans warm, as sea levels rise, it has been forecast, and we are already seeing the verification of those forecasts, the validation of them, in more frequent and more intense severe tropical weather coming into the United States. So for this talk, some of you may have missed the beginning of this, but we're going to focus on Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, and what 7 species of birds that we were tracking remotely at the time, what they did in the face of those storms. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the aftermath and how it affected the birds that depend mostly on a marine environment as opposed to a terrestrial freshwater environment. By the way, I should say Avian Research and Conservation Institute is a nonprofit. We're based in Gainesville, Florida. We're 501c3. Donations are tax deductible and most welcome. And I can say that they're particularly welcome as we see government agency, federal, state agency budgets, natural resource agencies. We see the funding from these agencies for conservation-related research getting smaller and smaller and essentially disappearing. A bigger part of that message is that we are losing some incredible people, dedicated, knowledgeable, institutional knowledge of our national wildlife refuges, particularly, but also the other scientists in the federal agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Geological Survey, and the state agencies, of course, in our case, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I'd like to acknowledge here my 2 co-authors, Amanda Powell on the left. Oh, I have their names backwards. I do know them better than that implies. Amanda's on the left and Gina's on the right. And there are 2 reddish egrets in the upper left, one with a satellite transmitter on, and no, they are not named Gina and Amanda. And we've never really considered that until this moment. But we'll let that slide. So here are the species that we were tracking at the time. First of all, Hurricane Irma came through. So the time frame here is Irma made landfall, I think it was landfall, or close to it, on September 11th of 2017. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what came next, Hurricane Maria, which was offshore, but did quite a bit of damage as well. That was September 14th and 15th. So in quick succession, that's what happened. The map in the lower left shows you the path of Hurricane Irma. Pretty typical for hurricanes that come up off the southern Atlantic through the Caribbean and find their way up into the southeastern U.S., either in the Gulf or on the Atlantic side. So we were tracking at the time. I should say, when we say remote tracking, this is either, these are devices the birds carry that collect GPS fixes, usually on the order of 1 every 2 hours throughout the day and a little bit into the night. These are very accurate to within 10 or 15 meters. This is an incredible breakthrough of the last decade and a half or so. Being able to track wildlife at this very, very highly accurate scale by these devices that collect GPS fixes where the animals are, they store them, and then in our case at 2-hour intervals, the other half of this tracking device, a transmitter, either sends them up to satellites in geostationary orbits, so fixed in space, or the GPS data gets sent out over the cell phone system to the nearest tower. And in both cases, satellite and cell phone, we then are able to buy the data from the companies that are involved in making all this possible. So we had reddish egrets tagged, magnificent frigate birds, swallowtail kites, short-tailed hawks. We were tracking American kestrels a little bit, reddish egrets, snail kite I mentioned, white-crowned pigeons. Yeah, that should be the whole complement of them. And I'm going to show you them in different places. First of all, swallowtail kites. At this time of year, swallowtail kites have migrated out of Florida for the most part. Now we're talking about mid-September. However, there's one bird that is particularly special to you folks. It's a male swallowtail kite named a popka. This bird was injured during the nesting season as an adult in 2017. And it has now, we have tracked its migration southbound to South America for 5 southbound seasons, and now coming north for 4.5. So this bird was rehabilitated by the amazing and very wonderful folks at Avian Reconditioning Center in Apopka. And they do an incredible job evaluating whether the birds can be healed and repaired to the point where they can be safely released and expected to survive. But they've been very brave about this. They've asked us, they give us the opportunity to tag some of these birds so we can see what their fate actually is after their rehabilitation. A lot of people say, oh yeah, well, it's great. It's very humanitarian and it's all warm and fuzzy to take in injured wildlife and heal it up and release it. But how well do they really do? Well, we know in this one case for Swallowtail Kite that they can do very well. This male apopka, I'm going to elaborate on the whole season of the Swallowtail Kite. That's a talk we give in itself, but they go 5,000 miles at least southbound for the winter. And then after a couple of months, they turn around and they start back. So over 10,000 mile round trip, very precarious. Apopka was healed. We put a transmitter on it with the support of the mayor of Apopka, citizens in the town, in the area. Audubon chapters, including Orange Audubon, contributed quite a bit to the cost of tagging and putting these devices out there. Apopka left later than other kites, but that put it almost in the face of Hurricane Irma. You would think this bird is having terrible luck that year. In fact, Apopka had been lingering, not really moving much at all. We thought the bird was okay, but just perhaps not up to migration. We really didn't know what was going to happen. And I was particularly not feeling very optimistic. Well, as Hurricane Irma started getting close in the Caribbean, while we were still having very sunny skies, calm winds, the pressure was not yet dropping. People often invoke this as one of the weather variables that might trigger movement by animals. Apopka made a sudden move southward, not to Lake Okeechobee, where they often rest and stage, get ready for migration, not to the Big Cypress Swamp, where they do the same, or not to the southwest coast of Florida, but all the way to the southern coast of Cuba. So this bird that had been seriously injured sensed somehow or felt the need to get out of there, and it moved much farther than any swallowtail kites usually move when they start their migration. They get down to the southwest coast and then they make that jump over the Yucatan Peninsula. So we immediately knew that we were going to see some amazing things perhaps out of Apopka if it managed to survive its first migration. It did, and its transmitter just quit about a month ago or so, a little bit more, when it was still in South America, but had started its northbound migration, its fifth northbound migration, almost five full migration cycles. So what an amazing bird. What an amazing species. We also had 5 adult reddish egrets tagged at this time. Now, we're talking about a marine species, birds that spend their time on saltwater coasts. They are one of only 2 wading birds we have in Florida that are predominantly marine in nature. So they feed on saltwater or brackish water species of fish. And these 5 birds that we had tagged at Sanibel, with the help of Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, the Darling Wildlife Society, Sandcap Audubon Society, International Osprey Foundation. These are the tracks of those 5 birds before the hurricane, before Irma. We have been tracking them since 2016. And as you can see, they don't go very far. This was a real important thing that we learned about reddish egrets, that the world learned about reddish egrets, by putting these amazing tracking devices on them. So of course we wondered, they're going to be in the path of a very severe storm. What are they going to do? So the top picture on the left is the map I just showed you. The map on the bottom is what they were doing from the 6th to the 15th of September. Remember, Irma passed on the 11th, right in the middle of this interval. And you can see that what they did basically was stay right on their existing home ranges and really pull in toward the center, toward the core area of those home ranges. So a home range is generally, it's the term used to describe the space that an animal uses. It could be year-round, that makes them a resident species. It could be during the breeding season home range or the wintering home range if they're a migratory bird. So in these birds' cases, they just pulled right up into the center of their range for the hurricane, and they sat it out right where they were. So it immediately started to get very interesting. When we saw this with the reddish egrets right on the coast, we thought, oh, wonder what kind of a pattern that is. Well, at this time, we also had one of the very rare short-tailed hawks in the United States. The breeding population in Florida probably numbers no more than about 250 or 300 pairs. And that is almost the entire U.S. population. There's a small number in southern New Mexico, Arizona, just a few pairs, a handful of pairs that somehow have come up from Mexico. So we had the good fortune to be tracking a short-tailed hawk by satellite with GPS receiver on board. And the blue dots represent the GPS fixes for this short-tailed hawk right before Hurricane Irma came through, right before the weather started to turn kind of crazy. So you can see the red areas are preserves. Those are wetlands, the habitat, forested wetlands, inland and coastal wetlands, the areas that short-tailed hawks really like the most. So you can see these are the normal locations. The short-tail spent some time in those preserved wetland areas, but then foraged a lot in the urban areas, which is my cue to tell you that short-tailed hawks are particularly interesting because they eat almost entirely birds. And that's unusual for this genus of hawks, buteos. Buteos include the red-tailed hawk, the red-shouldered hawk, broad-winged hawk, and the short-tailed hawk. So they're broad-winged hawks that often feed on rodents, maybe the occasional bird, ground-dwelling bird. Short-tailed hawks hunt birds in the forest and in open lands and shrubs. So they're more like an excipitor, a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk, or even a falcon, like a peregrine falcon, the types of birds and the habitats in which they hunt, or over which they hunt. So blue dots, that's where the short-tailed hawk was before Hurricane Irma came. And during and immediately after Irma, this is what the bird did. Not greatly different. Remember, you're looking at the blue circles. Those are the locations. Not too different, but what it did is it moved more into the red areas, the denser forested areas. I'm not sure you can see my cursor, but over here to the left, this red area is Sawgrass Lake Reserve. And that's actually where the birds
We can see it.
Thank you very much. I'll move it out of the way. So Sawgrass Lake, yeah, this is before Irma. And during Irma, this bird moved back into its forested nesting habitat, and also spent some time out along the coast right after the storm passed, out in the forest along the coast, not in the more open urban areas. I'll tell you a little bit about snail kites in the face of Hurricane Irma. But first, just to give you an idea, back in 2007, we started putting these remote tracking devices on snail kites because there wasn't any telemetry being done since some beautiful work done by Rob Bennett back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Rob Bennett came up with some great inferences, conclusions, recommendations about snail kites, which unfortunately conservation agencies have yet to embrace. But one of the things he discovered by doing a radio tracking study, so this is the old-fashioned VHF radio stuff that he was doing, not this map, but tagging a very large number of adults and juveniles and flying around Florida to locate them. He came up with survival estimates. He also came up with great movement data and habitat estimates that had been ignored, and telemetry was no longer utilized for quite a while. 2007, though, we came along and thought, well, let's put some of these remote tracking devices on and see what kites are doing, snail kites are doing. Well, it turns out that what we found immediately was each colored dot, by the way, is an individual bird. And these red hatched areas are the publicly owned large wetlands like Lake Okeechobee and the shorelines, Everglades, Big Cypress. These red hatched areas appear also, and the upper Kissimmee River Basin up here south of the town of Kissimmee. These places, these publicly owned wetlands, these are the places where snail kites are being monitored, and whatever little management is happening or thoughts about management, it's focusing on these red-hatched areas. And yet when we track these birds, this is 5 years of tracking for 12 birds tracked by GPS. 60%, and that's a low estimate, of these fixes are outside of these monitored and managed, quote, managed areas. They use a lot of habitats that are not protected. And as you also see, take any one color here, yellow or light green, for instance. Look at how much these birds move, these red dots, how much they move over the course of these years. And actually, I can tell you it's within years. They'll make these sudden movements. Almost, this is the whole US range, basically, of breeding range of snail kites right here, this part of the Florida Peninsula. Look how much these individuals move. This is not like a red-tailed hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk or any other bird that spends the winter of the breeding season in Florida. They're sort of nomadic. And what they're doing is they're finding and remembering where refugia are, places where they can go and find their apple snail prey in drought conditions and flood conditions when those snails are no longer available to them. So we thought this was we thought it was kind of groundbreaking, except for the fact that Rob Bennett's had already discovered it. And that's the value, I think, of this work. We have reaffirmed that, perhaps even more dramatically, and with a whole lot less field work, I'll have to say. This was far easier, just more expensive than what Rob did. So that's a little background on our snail kite study. And these are just some maps for individuals. This is one individual. The red dots are during the breeding season. The blue dots are during the non-breeding season. But this is one male over the course of 5 years, and he covers the entire snail kites range. And this is a female doing essentially the same thing. And what you see are their core areas at different points on these movement pathways. So this is not this bird is not simple in the sense of they will stay in a particular area, be strongly faithful to that. And these are the areas that we can save. And if we save these areas, we can save snail kites. It is not that simple at all. So what do they do in hurricanes? Well, we have 4 birds tagged as Irma approached. This is September 7th, 4 days before. And these figures here, the green, red, yellow, and the blue all the way over here, north of Waxahachie National Wildlife Refuge. That's right before Hurricane Irma. And this is during. This is September 11th. These birds are in the same places, but this bird over here actually moved closer to the path of the storm. They stayed put, or they moved closer to it. And right after Hurricane Irma, 4 days later, they were all right in what had been the path of Irma. So they did not appear to be put out, figuratively or literally, to any great extent by passage of the hurricane. And remember, they're occupying open wetlands, whether they're foraging or roosting, sleeping. Oh, let's switch to a different bird, a seabird. We did a tracking study of common terns with some wonderful people with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We tagged common terns way up here on National Wildlife Refuge land on Petite Manane. It's part of a complex, I think, of 12 islands that are collectively represent the main coastal National Wildlife Refuge complex. And we tagged these birds, we tagged the common terns as a surrogate for seeing how they would do carrying transmitters so that we might be able to study roseate terns, which are in fact endangered. So what we are using is a 2-gram satellite transmitter, no GPS capability, but we can still get coarse fixes. A solar-powered satellite transmitter you can see here in the upper left. And these were given to us as prototypes for microwave telemetry, a pioneering company that developed satellite telemetry and turned it into an incredibly beautiful and effective technology. These were prototypes that they gave us to try. They sell them for $4,500 each now, but We were very fortunate to have them. So we did this study, tagged these birds up in the refuge system, working with Pam Loring and Linda Welch of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And what we saw, we didn't get a long term of data from these birds. They're solar powered, but the transmitters were very fragile. But what we did learn was, in this case, Hurricane Jose was out there in the Atlantic as these birds were moving south. And so what you see here is the southbound track of one tagged bird. I'm going to come back to Hurricane Maria. This is the third hurricane that applied just to the common tern tracking. So this bird was tagged on Petite Manane in June of 2017, and in September, they were still loitering up in the Gulf of Maine and in the Cape Cod ecosystem. But on the 14th to the 15th of September, around the time of Hurricane Jose, one of these birds started moving south. And what you can see is it went through this front system and down here to the northeast edge of Hurricane Jose. And remember that hurricanes, tropical depressions, low pressure systems, they rotate counterclockwise and in toward the center. And the rest of the story, one of the beautiful things about weather and climate and all that, planet Earth, is that high pressure systems rotate outward and clockwise, at least in the northern hemisphere. So in this case, this hurricane rotating counterclockwise, and this tern got in the northeast edge of it and just took a ride all the way around here, and you can see its track. It obviously didn't avoid the storm, it used it to its advantage. Pretty amazing. Small birds. I mean, look at these things. They're so fragile. This is a roseate tern over here, but incredibly tough. I don't know how else to say it. You know, it's dangerous to attribute such human traits and thoughts to birds, but here you go. You know, can you imagine doing this, even in a big, powerful airplane? And some more details of that tern and another one as they got a little farther along, and they were confronted by Hurricane Maria. Same thing. I don't know that they went through the eye at exactly the same time. I doubt it, but they were in the storm as it was passing. Okay, so now I'd like to tell you, well, I'll tell you just a little bit about white-crowned pigeons. Then I'm going to come back and talk about the pigeon and the frigate bird and the terns a little bit in terms of what they face in the future, because they have affinities for more marine environments. So white-crowned pigeons, the U.S. population nests entirely in the Florida Keys and a little bit in the mangrove forests off of Everglades National Park. They migrate out of Florida, or at least 85, maybe as little as 75% migrate out of Florida during the wintertime, and they go out to the Caribbean or the Bahamas system, Greater Bahamas Basin, basically. White-crowned pigeons are amazing birds. They're beautiful. They're very, very fast flyers. They've been hunted all over the place, all over the Caribbean. They still are, sometimes with good management practices, and other times with no management at all. A lot of poaching. The species is precarious, to put it mildly, and the whole U.S. population breeds in the Keys, basically. So we use the VHF, as you see up here, old-fashioned radio transmitters, but also small satellite transmitters, a little bit bigger than the ones on terns, also made by microwave telemetry. One of the reasons these birds are hunted so much is because, I am told, it's very sporting, because they're extremely fast. If you're in a hardwood hammock in the subtropical or tropical zone in Florida, and you see them come through, you think a jet plane has just flown past you. Here's what. Well, here we are. This is Big Pine Key. Big Pine Key, where key deer live, and a lot of Big Pine Key is set aside as the Florida Key Deer National Wildlife Refuge, one part of the Keys complex of refuges. This is what habitat looks like. And the reason white-crowned pigeons are in this kind of habitat is because they are foraging on the fruit of hardwood hammock vegetation, West Indian tropical hardwood species. Poisonwood is one of their favorite fruits, as is the fruit of the gumbo limbo trees and other things, plenty of other tropical hardwood species like black torch, etc. So that is what they rely on for food. They are totally fruit eaters. And so they rely on hardwood hammocks that have fruit-producing trees. And the deer, so what you see on the left here behind the deer, those are not traps to catch the deer. Those are the mist net arrays that we use to catch white-crowned pigeons to put transmitters on them. But, and the deer just happened to make a cameo appearance when Chelsea was taking this picture. I did want to point out this telephone pole here on the right and the heavy transformer. And this is right before Hurricane Irma. So a lot of white-crowned pigeons in this habitat at this time, a lot. And this was right after Hurricane Irma, same place. The deer had been standing right over here. And this is the telephone that used to have a heavy transformer on it, which is now hanging down here by a wire all the way down to the ground. So this is the impact on the white-crowned pigeon's only foraging habitat. This is what it looks like from the air. These vegetation landscapes should be green at this time of year, mid-September. They are brown because the trees were stripped of their foliage, and in many cases, the trees were killed. One of the things that happens on mangrove islands is that the fringe are usually red mangroves, but the interior trees often are these sort of orchards, groves of black mangrove, and it is the black mangroves the pigeons nest in. Well, the black mangroves are in a lot of wet sedimentary soil, and sedimentary not in the geologic sense, but freshly made, and from overwash from prior hurricanes. So that's where black mangroves grow. But in order to live in that environment, the black mangroves have to send up pneumatophores, which look like tiny cypress tree knees that you would see in a swamp, so that they can breathe through that wet, muddy substrate. When those pneumatophores get inundated by overwash from hurricanes, the black mangroves die, and the nesting habitat of white-crowned pigeons is lost. So prior to Hurricane Irma, Barracuda Key, way down here off of Key West, there's US 1 ends right here, and this is an archipelago out here before you get out to the last, almost last set of offshore islands off Key West. The Marquesas Keys are out here, 15 miles from Key West. This is about 8 miles from Key West. And of course, dry tortugas are out here, another 70 miles. But note this, Barracuda Key supported the largest breeding population of white-crowned pigeons in the United States prior to Hurricane Irma. It was destroyed, actually, prior to Barracuda was the center of abundance for breeding pigeons prior to the hurricanes of 2004 and 2005 and tropical storms. We had Ivan, Wilma, Katrina, Charlie, Rita. I think Francis was in here somewhere too, in these 2 years. And what happened was this colony out in Barracuda Key, out here, got destroyed. And as a result, the center of abundance of breeding white-crowned pigeons moved up here to these keys. This is just east of Big Pine Key, No Name Key. Marathon is right here. So these are the islands you see from US 1, beautiful, scenic, this set of islands out here. That complex is where, until 2017, September 11th, when Hurricane Irma came through, this is where most white-crowned pigeons had started nesting after losing Barracuda Key. This is that set of islands. This is the area around Bay Honda State Park, which is just out of the picture to the right. 7 Mile Bridge going out to Marathon out here to the east. Again, these should be green. They're all brown. This is 4 days after Hurricane Irma. So what happened to the white-crowned pigeons? What happened to the white-crowned pigeons during the hurricane? They survived for the most part. One bird did not. However, we lost 3 of the tagged birds that we had, and we were tagging less than 8, tracking less than 8 at a time. We lost 3 of them within the weeks after Hurricane Irma, and we think it was because their foraging habitat, as you can see out here, brown instead of green, had been destroyed by the hurricane. So this is an effect of these severe tropical storms and hurricanes that we're going to be seeing more of all the time with climate change. And even if the birds have the wherewithal, have the evolutionary wherewithal, and whatever it is, the spirit, the aeronautical design, to, I mean, it's tempting to imbue them all kinds of traits, like, but we don't have to go there. But they can survive the hurricanes themselves, personally, individually, but they can't survive what they do to their habitat, especially when they rely on such small patches in such isolated areas. Another species that this applies to is the magnificent frigate-bird, which we've done a lot of tracking of. And you can see right here that there's a single breeding colony of frigate-birds, magnificent frigate-birds in the US, located in the Dry Tortugas, way out off of Key West. It used to be out there. And it moved in 1989 and 1990. I'm sorry, it was originally in the Marquesas Keys, originally in the Marquesas Keys until 1989. So remember, that's just 15 miles west of Key West. That's where the single US colony was, and it supposedly numbered about 250 nests. That area was subjected to a lot of boating and recreational and partying disturbance in the Marquesas Keys. The catch-22 for this bird was they were nesting on an island, mostly on an island called Bird Island, that was in an interior embayment that is technically a safe harbor in nautical terms. So people have access to that area by boat, even though it's a national wildlife refuge, part of one. They have access to that area by boat in any weather. Well, that was where the frigate birds nested. And the islands that they nested on were gradually being beset by more and more boating disturbance. Literally, I've seen pictures on the keys where they were nesting, where the boats would just be shoulder to shoulder, pulled up on the sand, people partying, they bring out their dogs, et cetera, et cetera. This is a national wildlife refuge, but it's a very, very difficult disturbance to manage for the refuge managers because it is so popular. And that's a very sad thing when you think that these birds have that one place to nest. So now they have moved out after 1989 and 90. They moved out to the Dry Tortugas, and the colony is smaller. It's been under 200 pairs, and more recently down to about 100 nests. And I'm going to show you, I'll come back a little bit to what we'd like to do with magnificent frigate birds in terms of management. This is one bird. I think this is just so cool. Let's go up here to the start. This is where the bird was on the 9th of September, 2 days before Hurricane Irma came up here like this. And remember, counterclockwise, winds like this. Imagine that overlaying on this picture. This bird, as Irma approached, decided, I guess it did. I guess it had to have been some kind of a conscious decision, moved offshore and took those northeasterly winds all the way out to the edge of the continental shelf, which is probably a good place to forage for fish. So here it is on the 10th, the day before Irma. Yep, Irma's getting closer over here, but it's all the way out in the way. On when Irma passed through, it was at its farthest point, and as soon as Irma passed, this bird continued to ride this counterclockwise flow and came right back in by the next day to Sanibel Island, and then run right back up the coast to where it had been before it was interrupted by the hurricane. Now, this is after Hurricane Irma is up here somewhere. It turned into a tropical storm. It came right back to where it started. This bird did exactly the same thing again the next year in Hurricane Hermine. We have a track for it, but it's exactly the same pattern, the same individual bird. This is a pair, a female on the right, male on the left. And we put satellite tracking devices, GPS equipped devices on 5 frigate birds, 7 total actually, 5 of them in the lower keys and then 2 more out in the dry tortugas, to see what they do during the year. This is Gina Kent, Steve Alsop, or Jessica Brown. Catching these birds, you have to do it at night. You have to do it right on the edge of mangrove forest. You take them off their perch gently, spend about 20 minutes putting the radio on very gently and carefully. They're very small radios relative to their size, and you very gently put them back on the limb. I've done this in the breeding colony also. I'll show you in a second. And the birds just stay there until the sun comes up, and then they start moving around again. So we tagged 7 birds in the lower keys and in the dry tortugas. And this is what their tracks look like. These are the 4 of the 5 birds that we tagged in the lower keys. And you can see that they winter up here. And then during the breeding season, this female goes down and she nested on the southern shore of Cuba. And this male went over here and nested over here. Cancun is right here, you might know that. But along the northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, this was a female that nested here, but would go offshore and forage out here, et cetera, et cetera. So breeding season, and then for the winter, unlike a lot of species, they actually came north for the winter and spent it in the lower keys. So what we have in the lower keys, that ecosystem, that habitat, that supply of prey fish is supporting in the winter, not just the breeding birds from Florida that stay there. I'll show you that in a second. But birds from the Caribbean that are pouring in, going to the north. We have thousands of frigate birds wintering in the Keys and along the southwest coast of Florida during the winter. That's how good the habitat is. Our birds don't have to leave in the winter, and in fact, it actually attracts birds. This is the colony now, the present colony out in the dry tortugas. It's being nibbled away at. It gets smaller every year due to erosion and sea level rise. This is where it is. Key West, Barracuda Key, Marquesas Keys, dry tortugas. This is a male displaying on the nest, that red pouch they have in their neck. They can inflate it. This is a yellow, is a female that we tagged at her nest in the tortugas, and the green is a male that we tagged at a different nest. This is what the male does when he's not nesting, and even when he's supposed to be nesting. This is May. They pretty much abandon and leave the nesting chores to the females, who can only nest every other year because it's such a production for them to raise such a large young that they can't recover their condition in time to nest in a subsequent year. And the males really do very little. So this is the male's track all around the coast of Florida, and the females stay near the nest site in that ecosystem out there off the lower keys, except when she made this trip over to the tip of the Yucatan. So this is all 7 birds taken together. The 2 birds I just showed you, the male, the female in yellow, and the 5 birds that we tagged from the Caribbean population. One of the 5 did not last long. It moved down here. You can see it in green. It moved down to this coast of Honduras and Nicaragua border and died in a fishing village. I should say that what happens to these birds is they are hunted. One way that they catch them, frigate birds catch fish. They catch flying fish as they come up out of the water. That's one of their biggest sources of food. The other source, frigate bird refers to pirate ships, the frigates. And frigate birds pirate fish from other seabirds. So they're thieves. That's how they make their living, except for the flying fish that they catch when they jump up out of the water. So the way people catch them in these environments down here is, unfortunately, they take a flying fish and catch it, open up the belly, put a big hook inside, attach the hook to a fishing line, and when there's a frigate bird over their boat waiting for a flying fish to come up, they throw this dead fish up with a hook in it, and they hook the frigate bird, and they take it back for dinner.
Wow.
So this, these are remote coastal areas. These are places that are not even connected by roads. This is something that's always been done for a very long time. The things that we are doing to impact populations of frigate birds, I would say, are far, far more severe than what's happening in these situations. And just to tell you a little bit more while we're here, and I'll wrap this up. I'm trying to give you an idea. We've talked about where the hurricanes come, and I've shown you what they do. So we're talking now about one of the seabirds, basically, the terns, the frigate birds, and also the white-crowned pigeons that are basically a marine species in a lot of ways. And so anyway, we helped out Puerto Rico Department of Natural Resources by tagging some birds on the island, and that was a really fun and fruitful experience. I also went down to the British Virgin Islands and helped Susan Zalewski and Louise Soames to put satellite transmitters on frigate birds down there. And we tracked those birds from their nest sites on the Virgin Islands out here onto these feeding areas, and also over to the west on the southern coast of Puerto Rico. So when I showed you before, when I showed you where the frigate birds that winter in Florida, where they nest out in the Caribbean, that's over here. So we have those birds going up here to nest and coming back out in the Caribbean to breed. They winter up in Florida. And then these birds over here move their way westward and may be wintering over in here and in Florida as well, although we didn't track these birds long enough to know. Okay, so just really quickly, satellite fixes from frigate birds. One of the things that we proposed doing and started with the refuge biologist, Kate Garina, right here, was to try to figure out how to lure nesting frigate birds, some of the frigate birds, up into safer nesting environments protected in the National Wildlife Refuge System, closer to Key West, because they're running out of ground in that only colony down in the Dry Tortugas. It's disappearing. And they used to nest up in this area in these kinds of islands. So these islands are near Barracuda Key. These are about 6 miles west of Key West. They're part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. They're not disturbed too much, but they are disturbed enough. So we chose 3 of these islands, and what we did was we tried to trick some of the young frigate birds. Frigate birds don't nest till they're 5 to 10 years old. The average is about 8 years. They have to live 8 years before they even start nesting. And during that time, their plumage gradually changes in the breeding plumage. So what you see here is what looks like an adult male displaying. It's another one partially displaying. This is a female. These bowling pin birds are immature birds. These are 1-year-old birds, or recently fledged out of the Dry Tortugas colony. More frigate birds. Well, the interesting thing is all but one of these birds is plastic. This is the only living bird. And you can see the young birds are certainly attracted to decoys. We also know that slightly older young birds, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, probably not breeding yet, are also attracted to the decoys. So what does that tell us? What we would like to do is use this kind of an array, and we have. We put out these decoys, we put out fake nests in this good habitat, and then we put out solar-powered, automated, digital playback systems of vocalizations of frigate bird nesting colonies at 3 different times: the courtship phase, the nestling stage, and the fledgling stage. So time, stage-specific vocalizations. And we would change that little SD card with the MP3 files on it. We change it through the season. And we found that combination of nests and vocalizations and decoys lures in the pre-breeding age frigate birds. Our dream, well, what happened then was budgets got drastically cut to the refuges, even more than they had been since 2008. And the staff turned over, and they were really short-staffed in the lower keys, and we had to put this project on hold. We did all this with donations. We did this with unrestricted donations from ARCI and the abundant support of the refuge. It's a project that's just waiting to happen. One of the most exciting things that I think we are on the verge of. So this is just our thanks for the frigate bird work that we did. And I'll show you here some of the movements of the white-crowned pigeons. These are birds we tracked from the lower keys. Some of them go to Cuba. And the birds we tracked in Puerto Rico stay over there in this area. And we've also helped Jamaica natural resources folks tag and track birds there. And they're using this information to tweak their hunting regulations, which are very conservative, really admirable, I think, game bird management going on in Jamaica. It's been really a real pleasure and very rewarding to work down here in the Caribbean. So again, reddish egrets, hurricanes, what's it's going to happen? This is what their foraging habitat looks like. What does that look like after hurricanes? You can imagine. Great white herons. The only breeding colony in the United States is down here in the Lower Keys. We've done satellite tracking of these birds. There's one with a radio on it. They are large birds. They're the size of the great blue heron. They don't go anywhere. This is the entire range of one bird for a year, or for 5 birds rather, for a year. And these are different habitat types. And what we found was their most important habitat type, this is hurricane related, their most important habitat type is expansive seagrass beds. There's a strong statistical relationship. It's strong with expansive seagrass beds. That's where they're catching the fish. These are the nurseries of the fish that become the big game fish that drive so much of the fishing industry in the tourist industry. Recreational fishing in South Florida and the Keys. These seagrass beds, the dark green in this picture on the left, that is a single habitat that's critically important. I think I have a picture. I do not, and that's my mistake. Next time, I will show you pictures of what these nesting islands looked like after Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria. Completely devastated. Trees are all dead, sideways. Trees floating out into the water. Seagrass beds completely denuded just from the storm surge. And instead of being dark green, they're white with a lot of dead tree trunks scattered over there. What does that tell you about great white herons and where they're going to nest? Let me go back to this. I'm sorry, no, that's not it. So we've done aerial surveys for the Keys refuge system, and several years apart. Immediately after Hurricane Irma, so that was September, in February, we did surveys to see what the great white herons were doing, and they were on their nesting islands. They were on nests that they had built, flimsy nests that they had built, in some cases, in the trees where nests had been, where they had nested, but in fallen trees. We don't know how they did, but we did a subsequent survey and found that they had abandoned those islands because the habitat was destroyed. So again, the birds survived the hurricane. That's the message here. But their habitat did not survive, and therefore their breeding capability and the future of this population is now very precarious. And the hurricanes are not over. Last species, the mangrove cuckoo. We tagged 6 birds with those little tiny 2-gram radios I showed you that we put on Terns. We tagged 6 of them on Sanibel Island with the help of the refuge system, the Darling Wildlife Society, which is the Friends of the Refuge, and also Sandcap Audubon, International Osprey Foundation, private donors, and donated transmitters. And what we found was, the question was, do they migrate? Nobody knows. Do they stay for the winter or do they migrate? And what we concluded was they didn't transmit long enough or very well from the dense mangrove forest. They're solar powered. But 2 of the birds showed us that, yes, indeed, during the breeding season, they moved slightly north and occupied small areas where they were probably nesting. And other birds were breeding down here, but stayed for the winter. So that was a small data set, but a really nice breakthrough. And this is Amanda Powell taking a mangrove cuckoo out of the net. I'm sure if you've seen them, you know how beautiful they are, very hard to see. They're very hard to radio tag. Amanda and Gina are far better at it than I. And this is a bird soon after we released it. A great bird to track and study. So over time, all the birds I've talked about, I could put up a bunch of slides like this, but thanks to all these individuals and all these organizations that made all this work possible. Thanks to you for your attention and your time, and I'll gladly try to answer any questions if you're still around and awake. Thank you very much.
Everybody is still awake. This has been very fascinating. Okay, questions? Write your questions in the chat, please, and I will read them. And well, just could you start out with what can people like ourselves do to help other than donating? Any kind of citizen science, any kind of research that we can help him with?
We've been involved in a couple of several day workshops, federal and state, years ago when the agency started waking up to climate change and sea level rise. And it was really clear to me, and I offered this, and others readily concluded as well, the best thing we can do, the birds are going to have to do the heavy lifting when it comes to sea level rise, displacing birds from these coastal habitats. They really are. It's going to be hard for us to predict where their habitats are going to be replaced on the upland gradient as sea level rises. And forests and dry marshes, dry prairie get flooded and have longer hydro periods, inundated for greater parts of the year. That's a science that hasn't really been perfected yet. So what I like to think is the best thing we can do, and really, Deborah, we can all be doing this now, is contribute money, time, moral support, letters, everything you can think of that Audubon chapters do and do so well, to protecting these birds now and protecting where they are now so they can breed and build strong populations so that they can respond to these incredible impacts. They're going to have to do it. And there's only so much we can do to help, unfortunately. The other thing we can do, and it's a much shorter answer, this is not a political answer. Please don't interpret it that way. But if you see this problem, if you recognize it as scientists worldwide do, and if you love birds, think about it, please, when you vote. And that's at every level. And remember, from the local level, county, state, federal, so much of what we do that really has an impact, we can do at the local level. And that's where it's least political, usually. So roll up your sleeves, dig in. And if you'd like to contribute to our organization and to the kind of work we'll continue to do, down there in the lower left is my email address and our website address. So any other questions?
Let me see. Yes, we've got one more question. Delcy says, very interesting program. And I always want to know what happens to birds during storms. We need to stop building and destroying habitat. Yes. Anybody else have any specific questions? So that was, I've been watching the white-crowned pigeons in Big Pine. I didn't realize that they nested in the black mangroves. That's what you said?
Yes, they nest in the mangroves and they feed in an entirely different vegetation community, the hardwood hammocks. And it is that dichotomy that makes it possible for them to be there, that neither one of those habitats is sufficient for them to reproduce, neither one by itself. They have to have that combination reasonably close. So some of these pigeons go 8, 10, 15 miles. They gorge on fruit. They store it in what's called a crop. It's the same in raptors, kind of an area that can get enlarged in their esophagus. And they come back to the nest and they regurgitate that up for the young. I mentioned that their favorite fruit in Florida actually seems to be poisonwood. So the foliage, of course, of poisonwood, it's related to poison ivy, and or it's equally as bad. The pigeons are immune to it, but when we would go in and look at nests or do things in nesting colonies, which we did very infrequently, but that's in mangroves. But we would get nice cases of poisonwood from handling the birds when we put transmitters on them, because their feathers are covered with the oil from the poisonwood.
Oh.
Yeah, interesting. But the point is they deal with it. Their immune systems deal with it just fine. They even eat the stuff. So we don't know what's coming this hurricane season, but maybe now some of you may be standing out there on your porch when the wind starts picking up and the rain starts falling harder, and look at where the wind's blowing from and where it's blowing to, and the next morning look at what the forest looks like around you and think about what all those birds around you did, And as you can see, depending on the species, they all have their ways of adapting, but for the most part, in Florida at least, they do sit tight, which I think is just something amazingly incredible and inspiring.
Well, that was a good ending, but I do have another question.
Good. I was giving you a chance to come up with one.
If I see a swallowtail kite driving along the highway and I do an eBird entry, do you guys see that through eBird or?
Yeah, periodically, not as systematically as wish I had the time for, but yeah, we do keep up with that. But I'd also like to tell you that we have a sightings report button on our website. There's also a donate button up in the upper right on the home page, but there's a sightings. I had to say that. I'm sorry. It's in my genes. You can report sightings like that, especially if you think the birds are showing behaviors that suggest nesting. We're not doing nesting studies anymore. We did it for a long time. We learned a lot. But yeah, eBird though is a great place to report it, even if you don't report it to us. Just think about what people 20, 50, 100 years from now, biologists, bird watchers, birders, think about what fun they're going to have looking at eBird data.
Mm-hmm.
If we still have electricity then and technology. But just think about if we had that information now for 50 or 100 years ago, just think of what we would learn. I'm sorry, Deborah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, don't apologize for asking for donations for your organization. Can you tell them how you came from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and then formed that organization? Or no, from the National Park Service?
I'm sorry. What was the question again? What about the service?
You got frustrated with working at one of the federal agencies and then started it, to be specific and work on the things you needed to do?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a loaded question or a loaded answer. And I'll say this, and I say this to my friends and colleagues who work for those agencies. And ARCI does long-term and short-term research, but most of the species we study are not listed by the federal government as threatened or endangered.
Oh,
because most of them are not. I mean, just the birds I talked about tonight, the only one, if I'm thinking quickly enough, is the snail kite. And we study caracaras. Those are the only two listed birds because we saw for years, I come from a very traditional theoretical academic background in zoology, population biology, ecology, and evolutionary biology. That was a long time ago, but I always wanted to apply it to management. So that was the model I saw for ARCI. And that's what we continue to do. Collect data on imperiled birds that aren't getting attention because they're not being watched closely, and then try to solve problems and move on. And I am taken with how often we see solutions that are not by any means rocket science. And it doesn't take too long to figure them out. We don't have to do long-term grandiose studies. And I see a need for a lot more of that in the agencies. There's a lot of administration, there's a lot of bureaucracy. And sometimes there's just not a lot of good leadership. Sorry to say that, and that's not a personal condemnation, but our name is Avian Research and Conservation because we want to see our data applied to conservation. And I am past retirement age. I don't plan to go anywhere. I feel great, but it's very disappointing not to see all the data we've collected and reported on and made conspicuously available, to see it not getting applied to management when it can make a difference. The exceptions, there are some. Swallowtail kites made great progress, especially with timber companies and national wildlife refuges. One of the biggest satisfactions I have from my career. And some other things we're doing now with kestrels and a little bit with burrowing owls. Frigate birds, I gave you a good example right there. What can we do to provide some insurance for this species that in the United States has one small disappearing nesting colony? Well, we help them settle on, be attracted to islands that are in better shape and can be protected because they're part of one of the world's, probably the world's best national wildlife refuge system. If we can just keep recreational boaters, if we can have the political stamina and will to enforce the law. These are your resources. But the refuge police are very few in number, and the refuge administrators are under a lot of pressure not to make waves, no pun intended, for local tourism, recreational tourism businesses. Pure and simple. That's what it comes down to.
Mhm.
And the refuge managers are heroes. They put up with enormous amount of grief from every direction. So we try to make it easy for them, but it's still really hard.
So the Swallowtail Kite, although you have all this data, is still not federally listed in any way.
No, and actually, that's a good question because some of you are aware that we do national monitoring protocol at the end of every nesting season, and you can help. It's on our website. We tell you what to look for, and how to find nests too, for that matter. By taking systematic pictures of pre-migration communal roosts, we've been able to track the U.S. 70% of the U.S. population since 1989. What an incredible opportunity. It just fell in our laps by going out there and watching what the birds do. And in fact, what we've seen over the last 6 to 7 years is a slow but steady and indisputable increase of the swallowtail kite population. Fish and Wildlife Service is real happy to see it. They think it's because of work that's been done, we've been part of doing, and recommendations we've made to commercial timberlands, owners and managers, and also what the state and federal folks have been able to do with our management recommendations about wetland forests. So yeah, it's a nice story.
I heard that they're trying to get the Florida Keys Hawk Watch to extend to the swallowtail kite season.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. Swallowtail kites migrate out of here really early, way earlier than other migratory raptors.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about even as late as early as late June, early July, but the peak is leaving in the latter part of July, early August. But that's still very early. I and others believe that maybe they're doing that to get through the Caribbean and get back over land before the hurricane season really picks up. So yeah, that begs the question: are they at risk from earlier and stronger storms? Yes, they are indeed, and here's why. Bird ecologists, behaviorists have the strong suspicion that's been borne out by data. Okay, take migratory birds as a group and divide it into long distance and short distance migrants. When biologists look at the species that migrate short distances, we're talking about 100 miles or a few hundred miles, maybe less than 100 miles between breeding season and winter ranges. They can time their departure every fall on the local conditions because they're not going far, and they can guess that their destination is experiencing similar conditions. Is it an early fall or a late fall, early winter? Same with spring migration. So short distance migrants are thought to time their migration based on local conditions. Long distance migrants going so far away, the thought is their conditions locally do not predict what conditions are like on their winter range, 5,000 miles away for the swallowtail kite. Therefore, in the long run, long distance migrants are better to time their migration with the calendar. And that they do by being so incredibly able to measure day length without thinking about it. That is why the peak of the swallowtail kite roosting season is within about an 8-day period in late July, and that has not changed since we started watching in 1989. It has not changed. It has gotten broader. The peak is not so sharp, but it bears out that hypothesis that long distance migrants will time it based on calendar date. And therefore, long distance migrants may be in more jeopardy from climate change because they will not adjust to changing earlier falls and et cetera. Conditions that are really important to them, like hurricanes passing across the migratory route of swallowtail kites coming earlier. I'll tell you something that we don't know if this is related, but in 2020, when the birds left, the swallowtails left to go south. This is a great map and it's not here, but again, tell me, I'll show you sometime. We lost 2 out of 11 birds that were migrating south. We almost never lose a southbound bird in all the years we've tracked them. We had 3 birds go entirely off course. Instead of going to the Yucatan Peninsula, they went due west and wound out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. 2 of them got within 20 or 15 miles of the coast of Mexico, all the way on the west side of the Gulf, and both died because they only lasted about 4 days and nights over the water. A third bird who made it all the way out there as well, that we thought would die, got onto land and up to Houston, of all places, in the industrial zone of Houston, rested, got itself together, and made a successful migration south after a 2-week delay. We've never seen that happen during the southbound migration. The northbound migration is the dangerous one. So we worry that some things are going on, pressures that might change these birds' abilities to survive hurricane-related changes.
Well, I've been asking all the questions. Anybody else? Everybody's just saying what a great presentation and all, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for sticking it out. I know it's long.
All right, everybody. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next week for Bird Chat, perhaps. And again, Dr. Meyer, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Ending the broadcast.